today, just review the scraps we have from Leonardo's ideas for essentially doing away with the city of Milan as he knew it, and as was done here in a image certainly based only on a verbal description from a German woodcut from just actually slightly later than the time of Leonardo. That's with a Latin name for Milan, Mediolanum, the middle of the land. So to go over that, and then the great face-off between two of the towering geniuses of 20th century architecture and architectural thought, that's Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. Now, this was a map made that showed Milan roughly from Leonardo's time. I brought it in, actually, I had two things in mind here. Last week, I pointed out how much this is the typical growth pattern of cities that just grew up spontaneously, that there's sort of houses, even with large houses, quite crowded together. And there's a development, it becomes kind of like a radial development as it grows and then grows outward. You know yourself, the more irregular the streets are, it's just following the way something grew by its very nature. But this time, also, what I wanted to point out is that Leonardo wasn't the first to think of the value of having a water course within the city as means of transportation, among other things. So here's a canal from the river Ticino, which is about a dozen miles north of Milan. So that water was brought in, and then it goes off into smaller canals and channels here. And they're still in use today. And I think we should keep an image like this in mind when you're thinking of Leonardo's ideas, because this is several levels as well, built alongside. And also to keep in mind those images from roughly the same era of ideal cities, that notion of these broad plazas and well-organized spaces and buildings that come right into the plaza with sheltering arcades going around them and nice rows. So there's a kind of a visual unity and a central focus, which is not something that was known to them from life from Rome, but that Roman colonies were set up on a grid system and they had squares like this. So they could have some personal experience of it, but it's that idea of the central authority, someplace in the building, here in a temple. So Leonardo is operating in a world where there are other people thinking simultaneously about what should a city look like. There's this now new diversion of interest to just thinking about the city as a concept and what it should be, rather than just an agglomeration of buildings. And it's highly unlikely that everything that Leonardo includes in his scattered sketches and his voluminous drawings were ideas originated by him. Unfortunately, because it came to naught, he was doing this for Ludovico il Moro, the Duke of Milan, and Ludovico was driven out by the French. So that's a problem that all Renaissance artists faced, that they were dependent on a patron and the fate of their patron. So it never got to the place of there being, maybe there is, but I'm not aware of it. Leonardo's sort of like sketching out an overview of the whole arrangement of the city. He was still picking at pieces. Oh, we should do this, we should do that. As in these two drawings, with that signal feature of his thinking for the time was to have multi-storied buildings, and within the building there could be multiple functions. So here, these would be those canals by which all heavy traffic would be entering the city and could be unloaded and then brought upstairs into the buildings. Or also he had the idea that this drawing doesn't really show it, nor does this one, that there would be a hydraulic system so that you could sort of bring up the water so that you could get water on all floors of the building. And if there were businesses on the ground floor, any mechanisms in there could be water powered. So those kind of hydraulic screws that he was very interested in, there was a use for them there. And all what he called fetid matter could be removed from the city. And he doesn't indicate here exactly how it would be flushed out. There must have been a dedicated part of one of these channels or something, but that would also eliminate it from the city, so that a city would be spacious, hygienic. This is one also that gives some, do you see here, he's indicating, he'll indicate directions. He would plan his city so that the buildings were most advantageously placed to get the sunlight. And in this one, this then could be shops down here, and then the gentry, the gentlemen, could be living up at this level. This is kind of a curious one. Actually, I think to my mind, it's hard to decipher, although we'll just see what a model does with it. So he's putting in these staircases, and whether this is meant to be a kind of a cross section of a building, or if this is what he shows as an exterior. And that's what the model indicates here. But as I said last time, in general, he wanted the main stairways to be on the exterior. He didn't want to waste any inner covered space by stairs, because they do take up a lot of room. And he also then would have some light wells going through the building so that there could be circulating air, just as there was circulating water on every level. This is a little bit getting ahead of where we're going, but not much. The models that are now in the Museum of Science and of Leonardo da Vinci in Madrid, they were first produced in the 1950s. And that's the first time that Leonardo's thoughts about urban design really came to public attention, and then began to be a source of inspiration. Although it's not to say that what was there before in existence didn't show some, anyway, compatibility, because this is a building in Ferrara, which you see uses that idea of the exterior stairs. So here you have that model. Interestingly, this one is showing a cart on an upper level, where most, it seems that he's talking about being almost a totally pedestrian level up at here. And also you saw that the canals, there would be locks so that there could be shift if you needed to disgorge some goods that could come up this level or could go down below. He also, there's a drawing for a bridge he did, and it's a two-tiered bridge. So each level could have one-way traffic, so a better flow of goods and people and pack animals in the city. So his thinking was that essentially the city of Milan as it existed should be abandoned, and that there would be instead 10 smaller cities built closer to the Ticino River, not right on the river, so that there would be no trouble of flooding. But then there would be canals off the river, and they would go to these 10 cities. He didn't do here for his ideal city any planning of fortification walls, which is a curiosity, because this is the time when, as they say, cannon warfare was a major threat for every place. So now you get a total change. We leapt to the 20th century. And I am beginning as a transition, just show you several drawings by an Italian young architect, a man named Antonio Centalia, who still in his 20s died on the battlefield during World War I. So we have only his drawings and a manifesto he wrote. He was an Italian futurist, a whole movement in art that was to proclaim that Italy should be utterly transformed, to no longer be shackled by all the monuments of the past, to come into the 20th century. You know, one of the great futurist manifesto statements was, a motor car is more beautiful than the Nike of Samothrace. I mean, it was as confrontational as possible. And Centalia wrote a manifesto of futurist architecture. And these are some of his just thinking about what could a city be now? Because as I said now repeatedly, as this is an age of urbanization and the use of new modern materials, concrete is coming in, iron and then steel is coming in, railroads were coming in, so there could be much greater urban density. People could flock to the cities and the cities could be well equipped. So it was clear that building up to handle a maximum number of people in a small area was on the agenda. And these are just several of his drawings of his dreaming about what the city of the future would be. And you see, it's, of course, carrying on that idea of multiple levels with different functionings then being piled one on top of another, and great skyscrapers here. That one, you can't see too much what the functions would be, but here's another one with walkways over from, I don't know, should have checked when the first elevators, if they were late 19th century or early 20th, because how you're going to get up here to the top, but over to buildings that would have that step back, which didn't become part of New York building code till after 1916, so that there could be light coming down to the street and adequate light at all levels here. Or one more. Still looks like a futurist drawing. Well, you know who was inspired by this? Fritz Lang in the movie, the Metropolis. He drew a lot on Santalia's designs. This was in the air, other places as well. How best to exploit the potential of the new materials, and how most efficiently to reject the past, which had proved to be such a sordid and damaging legacy that produced World War I. And this is Mies Van Der Rohe, the great German architect, worked a great deal in this country. In the early 20s, he had this model he made for, I think it's 22 stories or so, a glass skyscraper. Because now it was possible to produce glass in great quantities. And if you used steel floors, the walls were well, we now just use the phrase for it. They're just glass curtains. The wall doesn't hold up any weight. It's something keeping the elements out. And all the weight is borne by the steel core in here. So he has this kind of idea, this prismatic, gleaming set of structures. Then we get to the two gentlemen for today. They were in their lifetime, well, let's say adversaries, if not enemies, in their way, quite different in personality and certainly in philosophy, equally interested in being dominant and knowing more than others. But here's Le Corbusier, that was the name he took for himself when he moved to Paris when he was 20. He was born in Switzerland, and his last name is Generet. He's never known by that. He's Corbusier, which comes from an uncle's name, but it really was from the Crow. And then Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright is exactly 20 years older than Le Corbusier. So we'll start with the work of Le Corbusier, though, just because of the happenstance of the way their ideal planning. What Corbu had in mind was published widely before Frank Lloyd Wright got involved. This is a painting by Corbu in the background. He was a painter, well, he's a polymath, like Leonardo. There are many consonances between him and Leonardo. He was an architect, a painter, a furniture designer, a writer, a thinker, probably a few other things in there as well. Here's a small statistic. There's 17 of his buildings on the UNESCO's World Heritage list. And there's the Carpenter Center at Harvard is his. He was an overseeing architect for the UN headquarters. He has work in Sao Paulo and has some of his ideas in Brasilia, the capital city of Punjab. He was a supervising architect for that. Many buildings in Europe. So worldwide reputation. Frank Lloyd Wright's reputation was also very wide, with work in India planned, and then in Japan completed, and ideas of his published in Germany that were extremely influential on artists like architects like Le Corbusier and also Mies Van Der Rohe. So I would say, well, let's just leave this on for what was a significant factor in the great power and ultimate success of these men is that they wrote beautifully. They have extremely persuasive rhetoric that inspired others. And I will read you some of Corbu's writing at some length in a moment. Just give you a couple of the buildings tracing the trajectory of his career that I was thinking you might know. This is a country house outside Paris done in the 1920s called the Villa Savoy, where here's his kind of a hallmark of lifting a building essentially up off the landscape, which would give anybody up here a view over a much greater distance and a sense of a kind of like an internal, well, that's why I like living on a high level in an apartment building. You see the whole world, you have a sense of mastery over a much greater distance. But there also is an essential part of his character that he was not by training, but by personality. There was the fine art side of him, and then also very much an engineer. The precision, the mechanical cleanliness of the machine, he exulted in. And in fact, the phrase that he produced that then has always been turned against him is he said, "A house is a machine for living," by which he meant that it should be well-oiled, smoothly functioning, not necessarily that it had to look like a machine. But we now just call this almost a machine aesthetic. Not too many machines look that smooth and polished, but that then just becomes a symbol. Or this church he designed in the mid-50s, which is completely different. He's the father of what's called sort of brutalist architecture, this very heavy, or at least heavy seeming concrete, thick walls, very assertive structure. And here it's all curves and all asymmetry, and gorgeous. So as a young man in Paris, he takes up the challenge. How do you build for a modern age? I mean, we are so demonstrably in a new world. Family life is not organized as it used to be. People no longer live out in the country and lead lives independent of others. It's an urban existence. Things are fast. You're around people whom you don't necessarily know. Just the whole tenor of life is transformed. Well, what kind of buildings are you going to create that are appropriate for this? Because putting on a Greek temple facade or the curlicues of the 18th century, although buildings are still going up with that is like a lie to your own age. So one of his ideas that was really taken up, because it's more an engineering idea, he's not dealing with decoration or design at all, is this drawing for a house. He called it the Maison Domino from about 1914. And he said, well, all you have to have is use the new modern material of concrete. He would have liked to have steel supports for these concrete slabs, but it was not available to him. So even that is concrete. It's a totally concrete structure. And he's reduced it to the absolute essentials with this reinforced concrete. It had so much greater strength than wood. And of course, you could not do this in brick. So you just have the floors projecting out from the supports. The supports don't have to be at the corners. And there don't have to be any interior walls to help support this level up here. So you have completely free space. And you can have cantilevered staircase outside. Leonardo, whose drawings he would not have known because they were not published till the 1950s. But that too, so that is an absolutely unencumbered space in here. So that suggests a new kind of freedom. Freedom to impose your own way of living on that, your own aesthetic on it. Well, of course, it doesn't actually work out that way. We move now to 1925, when there was an international, exposition of decorative arts in Paris. This is from which we get the name Art Deco. It was about primarily decorative arts, but it was, I don't think they had any machinery, so it wasn't exactly like a World's Fair, but here it is in Paris with a kind of elaborate, typical, fanciful fair architecture. And at this fair, tucked away was a house designed by Corbeau. And I say tucked away advisedly because the planners of the exhibition even put a wall around this and put it in a corner, hoping that it was not too much noticed because it was so discordant with everything else there. And he called it the house of the new spirit, of the spirit of the new age. There's a tree growing in the house, you notice here. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright will do that. But the reason it is here is for the fair, one of the preconditions was that no trees would be cut down. So he just built around it. But now here is the house with those slabs and a wall of glass on this side. Here it's 2-level. I think there's a separate level in here. So for many people, this was just execrable. This was so ugly. But to young architects in particular, this was just seemed such an interesting challenge to think in a new way of admitting a great deal of light into an interior like this, opening up, sort of bringing the outdoors in. Well, in this house, there was some furniture he chose. I don't think there was yet anything that he had designed, but there was also a plan, this plan, for a contemporary city. They called it a contemporary city for 3 million. Now, that's bigger than Chicago. I should say by this time he had published several books. One of them now goes by the name of Towards a New Architecture. And this book, when it reached the architecture schools of, say, Ivy League in the East, caused a furor. There were a number of student rebellions against their professors saying, you no longer teach us the old way. I mean, this new machine aesthetic, this new idea, Corbeau was right. We ought to be planning for our own age. We ought not to be planning for what was the past. So he was having just a really very great effect on things. So here he is with his idea for what should a city be? And and he writes about this, and I'm going to read you a fair amount of what he wrote about it. But he's not planning for any particular topography. This is just laying out the ideal. And you see what the ideal is based on geometry. So I say there are many similarities between him and Leonardo and builders of Gothic cathedrals, that sense that the whole core of the universe is geometry, and that's the ultimate beauty to which you must conform for complete pleasure. So let me tell you more about these buildings. And I'll tell you a little what he said about it. First of all, he said, the city today is dying because it's not geometrical. There's no first-rate human production but what has geometry at its base. It is the very essence of architecture. And then he said this was to construct a theoretically watertight formula to arrive at the fundamental principles of modern town planning. Well, the most obvious thing is that it's absolutely hierarchical and absolutely symmetrical. He builds a series of towers, and I think these towers were to be 60 stories high, glass-faced. And that's where, that was for business. And then around them, then flanking them, there are here apartment buildings. And these would be buildings largely for the people who worked in those towers. Then there would be workers housing a little bit further out here with inner courtyards. There would be The new city would be bisected by two main roads. The roads would be multi-levels. Generally, there should be, at least when you move in here, the roads on 3 levels. One level for trucks carrying heavy goods. This is to be at the lower level, so they could disgorge their goods at the base of these towers. Then a level for essentially sort of like Amazon trucks, trucks that carry smaller goods and have to go short distances one way or another. And then in the top, there would be great roadways, divided roadways, so the one-way traffic on either division for fast vehicles that are just going right through the city. And at the point where they intersect, there would also from underground be a railroad coming in. There would be one railroad station in the city. And at the roof, there was essentially a small airport for what he called air taxis. So all major transportation beyond the city centered from that one locale. I imagine that these were, this is a 1925 photograph, same year that this is proposed, of a street in Paris, but by a photographer who was capturing the city that was disappearing. But this street corner where the streets are irregular, buildings come almost to the street, and the forms are not uniform. Or an inner courtyard. Which we now think is extremely picturesque and worth going to see, of course. Now, Corbeau had kind of a historical sanction for thinking of completely redoing a city with long, straight streets, because in the middle of the 19th century, under Napoleon III, Baron Haussmann had to cut these great avenues through what were very poor working class areas and just made the poor go to the periphery of the city. And along these avenues, most buildings had to be about uniform height and uniform design. So there was a kind of regularity in the city already in practice. But now I'm just going to go with it, with first, especially where here's nice watercolor down here and a little bit of an aerial view from that, his idea for the plan. For the way Corbeau presents this to people. So the definition of the street, which is held good up to the present day, is a roadway that is usually bordered by pavements, rising straight up from it are walls of houses, which, when seen against the sky line, present a grotesquely jagged silhouette of gables, attics, and zinc chimneys. At the very bottom of the scenic railway lies the street, plunged in eternal twilight. The sky is a remote hope far, far above it. The street is no more than a trench, a deep cleft, a narrow passage. And though we've become accustomed to it for more than 1,000 years, our hearts are always oppressed by the constriction of the enclosing walls. Now, remember, he grew up in Switzerland and in a very small town in Switzerland. So he is not by nature an urban man. The streets consist of 1,000 different buildings, but we've gotten used to the beauty of the ugliness of it. These 1,000 houses are dingy and utterly discordant with one another. It's appalling, but we pass on our way. On Sundays, when they're empty, the streets reveal their full horror. But during the week, when elbowing our way through the crowds, those with eyes in their heads can find plenty to amuse themselves. It's better than theater, better than what we read in novels. But none of this exalts us with the joy that architecture produces. There's neither the pride which results from order, nor the spirit of initiative, which is engendered by wide spaces. Now I have yet one more long passage I'm going to read, because that's largely, he was talking about the streets. But there are plenty of other things beside which town planners have to provide. I should like to draw a picture of the street as it would appear in a truly up-to-date city. So I shall ask my reader to imagine they are walking in this new city and have begun to acclimatize themselves to its untraditional advantages. You're under the shade of trees, vast lawns spread all around you. The air is clear and pure. There's hardly any noise. What? You cannot see where the buildings are? Look through the charmingly diapered arabesques of branches and into the sky towards those widely spaced crystal towers which soar higher than any pinnacle on earth. These translucent prisms seem to float in the air without anchorage on the ground, flashing in summer sunshine, softly gleaming under gray winter skies, magically glittering at nightfall. They're huge blocks of offices. Beneath each is an underground station that would be for the subway. Since this city has a density of 3 or 4 times the density of our existing cities, the distances to be traversed in them are 3 or 4 times less. Now, what's they're talking about? You don't have to spend a lot of time commuting. You're not sitting on the subway for a lot of stops. You don't have to walk very far. For only 5 to 10% of the surface of its business center is built over. From the top to the bottom, the facades of the new city's office buildings form unbroken expanses of glass. These colossal structures evince no vestiges of masonry. All that remains visible is glass and proportion. And then he goes on and talks about there being roof gardens. At the evening, you can go up there. There are plantings. You can smell the aroma of the flowers in the evening. Shops would be on the ground floor. And there were 3-level pedestrian walkways. You can find many parallels between this and what in a decade is produced in Rockefeller Center with its multi-levels. And it has rooftop gardens as well. So that is his sense of what a city should be. Here's one of his drawings. One thing he talks about that in his drawings I don't see and don't fully understand, that he thought that things like utilities like that, water, sewage, electricity should not be underground, that they were too important. They needed to be up. You didn't want to keep digging up the streets to get at them, but I don't know where he would be putting them in the plans. But you can see people would be going in under these buildings here. And then the different levels. Well, he worked on this idea that is fleshed out in this contemporary city for 3 million. And he created a plan for the city of Paris that he was going to, he proposed, and this was presented it to government officials, about 2 square miles here to the north of the Ile de Setier here in Paris, where he again has these skyscrapers. Well, industrialists scoffed at this. Government scoffed at it. But he had the sense that cities are just inevitably so crowded now, and the areas where the workers live are so dingy and so unhygienic, shades of Leonardo's thinking, that you have to build up to get adequate light to people and to provide any area that can be open for greenery. This is one way he envisioned it. And then someone has done a video with computer modeling to see what it would have looked like. And here it is. Now, I don't know where he gets exactly this kind of honeycombed idea of the exterior, but this would have been Le Corbus's Paris. With charming accents of the old buildings. So I just brought in a view of Hong Kong. I don't know if any of you have ever been there. I have not. I do wonder what it's like if you're at the street level. You can see however many tall buildings they are, the whole thought of something uniform, the regularity of these, has actually put Corbus's reputation in especially bad light in about the past 10, 15 years. Because they say, well, what are his political leanings? Because this is so authoritarian. This is so totalitarian. And he was proposing this in the time of the Nazis and the fascists. So they have brought up Corbus's rightward leanings. I mean, he constructs some structures in the Soviet Union as well. And they said, well, he was associated with several fascist organizations. His cousin, who had always worked with him, went back to Switzerland during the years of World War II, while Corbus tried to get employment from the Vichy government. And then there are others who will say, well, no, he's just any place. Well, he's a naive architect. He will build wherever he's looking for anybody who will let him build. So it's with the rise of the far right, this has become a more disputed issue now in France than it was for a long time. So, well, I have one more building from him. When he's working on these, sort of where he thought people would be living, in the 1950s, he was able to bring this to fruition to some extent in Marseille. Oh, well, let me give you something here first. Maybe, actually, I just saw this in the news yesterday in some commentary. And you might remember this yourself. This is St. Louis. This is a Pruitt Igo housing complex built in the early 50s. Because I imagine this has dawned on almost everyone already. What Corbus is essentially suggesting is the kind of housing that's built for some slum clearance, these high rises with supposedly parkland around them that surround so many cities. You just go along the East River and you can see it in New York, but here it was in St. Louis. Well, these buildings called the Pruitt Igo Complex, and here you see them. They were meant to provide more livable spaces for the people who were crowded into the kind of dingy areas that Corbus was horrified by and they wanted to get people free from. But through all sorts of maladministration and everything else, the buildings were terrible. And in less than 20 years, they were brought to the ground. But I think that there's a new video saying that, the person who's done investigation on these and saying, well, it isn't just because of the architecture. They were riddled with all kinds of problems here that led to the destruction of Pruitt Igo. But so there's one or two structures that were built that carried out his idea of the way people would live in the habitations and it's actually called a unit of sort of habitation. It's in Marseille from I'll give you the right days, 47 to 52. Marseille was so badly damaged during World War II that there was just desperate need for something new, and he had an opening to do it. So this is now, here you're looking at it. Just as his plans for the city of 3 million, because he lifts the buildings up off the ground. That becomes a hallmark of a lot of his architecture. And then these are individual apartments. They're a series of different modular arrangements, and they get slotted into this kind of frame. So it's mass produced, but there's some degree of individuality, and his interest in color, you see there. And it's, in a sense, a vertical city, because there are, I think it's every 3 floors. Then there's an area. Well, here's one of the apartments. He was by nature pretty totalitarian, because he designed all the furniture for these apartments too. People could choose what color they wanted for the walls. That was the limit of what they could choose. But he made essentially indoor streets with shops, libraries. There was a theater. So you didn't have to go out into the city. And on the roof, I know there was a running track. There was a school for kids. You see a pool here. I think there's some other amenities. So the leisure of city is up here. Business was within, commerce was within, and then residential, all as a single unit. Pretty handsome. Gotta go beyond that. So we have Frank Lloyd Wright. I hope you know that Little House from the Little. It's not the house is not Little, but that's the name of the family, the Francis Little family, that owned a house in Minnesota in Frank Lloyd Wright's signature prairie style, this long, low, open one. So you know you have something really antithetical to Le Corbusier's thinking, or Falling Water. This is about the time of, I hope you also have seen that. If not, you've got to go to Western Pennsylvania to see it, from the mid-30s, which is when Frank Lloyd Wright's interest in urban planning, okay, time for that, shows itself. He was thinking about starting in the 20s. And then the story goes that in 1934, he had a lot of students working with him, Taliesin fellowships. They still exist. They're quite prized. And he had one student who was very wealthy, Edgar Kaufman Jr. His father owned a department store in Pittsburgh, and it's his father who, with his son's encouragement, had Falling Water built. So Frank Lloyd Wright was musing about how he would like to get his ideas about what a city should be out to the public by having a traveling exhibition of models. And Edgar Kaufman Jr. said to him, "How much money would you need to do that?" So he said, $1,000. Kaufman gave him the money. And within a year, this great 12 by 12 foot model was produced with some other models and some accompanying text. And he called it Broadacre City. And the significant feature in what he talks about it, he says, the city should be everywhere and nowhere. He thought the city essentially was an outmoded concept, that modern technology and modern communication meant that you no longer had to huddle in the dark streets as you had in older cities. Well, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright's background was a farm boy from Wisconsin, and that preference for wide open spaces that he knew were as much part of him as like Corbu wanting those soaring heights that he would have known from the Alps. So background affects a lot. Interestingly, because, two things about Frank Lloyd Wright. At this time, 20s and then into the 30s, he was considered the grand old man of architecture, whose day had passed. I mean, these young architects, nothing more to get from him. And he comes up with this totally vital plan, and he hasn't even gotten to the Guggenheim yet, which is, I would say, a building that also shows how much he disliked cities, because it doesn't fit the city environment at all. So these fellows who worked for him produced the plan, and there is text along with it. And some of this text you can read from this one. You can see it has an acre of ground minimum for the individual, and that is a key factor. He thought of this as being city as being a social organism rather than a collection of buildings or an organization of roads. He would be thinking of this. This is against the backdrop of the Depression. So he was very interested in social thought anyway. So he's coming at it from a different point of view than a man who comes from cities that had been demolished by World War I. So this was the key proposal of the city, which he suggested should expand across the entire United States. So there is no longer such thing as a single centralized city, but just this kind of arrangement everywhere, changing as the topography of the city needed it. It makes no changes to existing system of land surveys, has a single seat of government for each county, administration by radio and air odor, well, that's essentially plains. Architecture determined by the character of the area. See, it's as if he's withdrawing all that authority that Corbu's plan would assert. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright is every bit as authoritarian as Corbu, but it just takes a very different form. Because ultimately, it's not going to be any government that decides how it should be done. The decisions were to be made by an architect. So here's more, Sissy. No private ownership of public needs, no landlord and tenant, no housing, no subsistence homesteads, no traffic problem, no back and forth hauling, no streetcars, no grade crossings, no poles, no wires in sight, no ditches, no light fixtures, no glaring cement roads or walks, no tall buildings except isolated ones, no slums, no scum, no public ownership of private needs. And he lists the thinkers who inspired him for this. Quite a distinguished list. And here you have an aerial view of part of the plan. There is no central focus. This is an arena here. Then there's water that courses through it. I'll show you next, I believe, a slide that just gives you black and white labels for what these areas are right in here. So this should be museums, an arboretum, an aquarium. He recognizes some wealth distinctions, larger houses, minimum houses. And these are vineyards and gardens so that people who work in industry sometimes the workers would live in housing above the factories. Factories are not very, very large, and they would own their acre of land in the adjacent territory. This thinking of having an acre of land, of course, that's the farmer in him, but that's also a Depression era realization that if you have at least some land, I'm thinking of this, of what we're seeing in photographs from the Ukraine now. If you have a small patch of land, you can at least grow your tomatoes, your herbs. You might have some chickens or a goat. You can ultimately provide for yourself. And these few rare, sparse skyscrapers. He only himself designed 2 in his lifetime. For his drawings, there are many super progressive features. His vehicles, there was in the 30s an interest in 3-wheeled vehicles, and the design that was produced crashed, so that whole concept never went anywhere. But he had this idea that you have one-way traffic, and then most places the middle would be a monorail. He calls it an automobilized society, because he thought that's the way people get around, and they could get around easily. That would be democratizing. And the aerial view. The plots of land here. Here's that arena again we see, and a stadium. Always adequate sports facilities. Nothing large scale. Everything human scale. But ultimately also still organized by the far-thinking architect. And look at the roads and rivers spanning off. And there, little distance, there'll be another urban area such as this. So those 2 men have completely opposing ideas of what the ideal city for our modern age should be. And that's still an argument that's vital today, isn't it?
Maggie, what are those things in the sky?
Well, that's what he meant, we'd now put little green men in there. That's what he's thinking, that these would be like Corbu was talking about those little air taxis. These are just simple ways to get around by air. I presume these are sort of little helicopters. And I made it a minute before we're through. So please, I'll take questions or ruminations. I want to give you one rejoinder to Corbu's ideas. From a social thinker, a woman named Jane Jacobs. This has also become a cliche. It says, there's no creativity except in old buildings. The sense is that because they're things that are accidentally juxtaposed, that like ideas jostling against one another produce something new. And then, of course, you have Corbu, whose spirit longs for that sense of absolute order and peace for his ideas, evidently. And he painted every morning of his life. Okay.
What did he design, Corbu, in New York City? You said he worked on the UN. Any other buildings that you know of?
He was one of, oh, he was really ticked off by this. He thought he would get to design one of the buildings, but he was appointed as a sort of a supervising architect. So he didn't really get to make his stamp on it the way he wanted to.
How about other buildings there?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Of course, well, this is, thank you for bringing this back to New York City. And I should say, even Corbu's ideas or even Elia's ideas, part of what they were inspired by originally was America. We might think this is pretty retrograde, what Frank Lloyd Wright has in mind. But the Europeans were looking at things like grain silos, and the first skyscrapers were in Chicago, essentially. They weren't all that high, but the first 10-story, 12-story buildings. So they saw efficient roads, efficient train systems. They saw these gleaming silos, and they thought, this is the future. And in New York, what they saw was Grand Central Terminal with its multi-levels, since the train yards were covered over. So you had the trains underneath, and then you had commerce, and you had the great gathering place. And then of course, now they have those ugly offices up above. But that was their sense of what the kind of node should be for transportation in their new cities.
Thanks.
Sure. Any more? All right. Enjoy the rest of your summer, please.